In his autobiography, Tal said that this game was unofficially judged to be the most brilliant of the 1962 Olympiad. I'm not exactly sure what constitutes unofficial judging, but I'll let you make up your own mind about the incredible and famous sacrifice that Tal offered in this position. Tal opens up the game with pawn to d4, a refreshing change of pace from the many e4 openings we've seen him play. After d4, his opponent responds with knight f6, and we get into a queen's Indian defense defined by the development of the knight to f3 and the bishop to b7. Both players develop with natural moves, and the balance of power in the beginning of the game isn't disrupted too much, although strategical battle lines are drawn. Here, after bishop h4, black gives up the bishop pair with bishop takes c3 check. This is unprovoked, so it can be seen as a small success for white, but black is playing for the strategic goal of closing the position, which will favor the black knights over the white bishop pair. The knight pulls back here, and black expands with e5, and Tal builds a strong center. The critical first moment in the game happens here after black pulls back with knight to f8. Now, Tal sees this as a bit of a red flag for very good reasons. Black is playing an undeveloping move saying, hey, the position is closed, my knights are okay, and because the position is closed, I have time to maneuver to my optimal knight squares. I can do that too before castling and save some time, because if I had castled, I wouldn't be able to put my knight on f8 because the rook would be in the way. So this is the right way to do things. Now, Tal says, basically, in this position here, I have the bishop pair. I'm also closer to castling. I also have a nice center. Therefore, I should open things up. And he does so with the move pawn to c5, which makes perfect sense given the arguments I've just laid out. In fact, Tal gives this move an exclamation mark in his annotations to the game. However, objectively, this is probably a mistake. The computer certainly thinks so, and computers are pretty good at chess these days. The problem is that after black captures on c5 and Tal captures back on e5, certainly the right way to capture back, trying to open the position, queen takes e5, queen a4 check. Black has a strong move here. It's not the move played though. Black can play knight 8 to d7, and it's not clear what Tal intended to play in this position. Black is actually fully developed here. All the minor pieces are out and on decent squares. Black has an extra pawn. Black's queen is tremendous on e5. Now, you can say that white can try to gain time by attacking the queen with the minor pieces, but there's no really great way to do it here, partially because this pawn is hanging on c3, and although it might seem greedy, black can go and take that pawn. Also, black is ready to castle on the next turn. So this position is actually quite good for black. Instead, though, in the game, black didn't play knight 8 d7. I think the reason is it is hard to adapt even for a great player like Hecht when the position starts changing. So in this position, now we're seeing an open position, whereas a moment ago it was closed. A moment ago, it made sense to try to put the knight on g6, and now you've got to go and put the knight back on the square it came from just a few moves ago. Even for great players, it's hard to do that. It feels like you're admitting a mistake, but chess is a game where you have to be flexible and adapt as the position changes and opens or closed or otherwise develops. So Hecht played the move pawn to c6. I hate this move. This move blocks the bishop here on b7, which is a truly sad development. It also frees up the d6 square, which was protected a moment ago, and the white knight can easily reach that square in some critical lines. After pawn to c6, Tal simply goes ahead and castles here, and Hecht plays knight g6. Now, if this bishop simply pulled back, for example, here and then knight here, then Hecht is going to be able to castle in just a couple of moves, and Tal is absolutely opposed to allowing that. Tal, of course, does not want black to castle, so we're not going to pull this bishop back. Instead, knight c4, upping the tempo, trying to gain time on the centralized black queen. That queen needs to move, so instead of taking on c3, which was possible but very risky after a trade here on f6, and then a hop into d6 check hitting these guys right here, which is the kind of messy position with an opponent's unsafe king that Tal would love to play, although the position is still playable for black here. Hecht pulls back here to e6, the safer option compared to capturing on c3. Again, Tal does not want to just pull this bishop back on h4 and let black castle, so pawn to e5, again pushing forward, trying to capture here and get a rook to the e file. Of course, black can't capture down here because rook e1, we are pinning on the e file and we are winning the black queen, classic. So after e5, Hecht realizes, hey, I'm not able to keep this position closed anymore. I have to go in for tactics myself, and he plays pawn to b5. In this position, Tal is forked here, the queen and the knight are hit, and this pawn, or this bishop, is still hanging here on h4. The good news is your opponent is only able to capture one piece at a time. This is a famous maxim from Tal. So he's going to continue with more sacrifices. Pawn takes f6. Boom. This move is brilliant. It is one of the most famous moves that Tal has ever played, and for very, very good reason. Tal is offering his queen here on a4, and his opponent does accept it. This is not one of Tal's speculative sacrifices where you're like, oh, when you look at it later with a computer, it doesn't work at all. In fact, this is a sound queen sacrifice. It might not have been the best option available to him, but it is very strong and difficult to meet for his opponent. I also think that Stockfish is underestimating Tal's chances in some of the lines that come about, because in so many of the lines, black's pawn structure in the endgame is so bad that black can be up a pawn and still be significantly worse in the position. So after black accepts the queen sacrifice on a4, we capture here on g7. The hit rook must move over to g8, and the question is, how does Tal again continue? In this position, he's down a queen for only one minor piece. So moves that do pin and win the queen back here are not getting back enough material. They will allow black to capture down and have a significant advantage after Tal regains what material he can. He must keep the attack going, and he does it with bishop f5. Boom, again, another brilliant move needed to follow up the amazing idea of sacrificing the queen. In this position, again, Tal is down a queen for one minor piece, and all three of the minor pieces that he does have on the board are hanging. Black can capture all three of these, and we'll look at all three choices. Queen takes c4 is the worst choice, but also one of the most aesthetic ones. After rook to e1 check, black's king is totally cut down in the middle of the board. The bishops are amazing. We understand why Tal so wanted to open the position for these bishops. The only way to stop mate is to give back the queen here. And actually, black is still okay on material after rook takes e6, pawn takes, and bishop takes g6 check here. It doesn't matter that black is up on material, though, because this king is getting hunted down. It must go to d7. We have rook d1 check here. And you want to try and stay in touch here with the bishop and keep this 8th rank open, so king c7. But this basically gets mated after bishop g3 check, king up, rook check, trying to win the bishop and defend g7, which would be a massive advantage. But then king here, bishop check, king here, and check mate. Amazing, amazing stuff to hunt down this king right here. There were other great lines for Tal and other lines that his opponent could play in defense, but ultimately black cannot hold after capturing this bishop or this knight here on c4. So what about capturing here on f5? That is possible, but after knight to d6 check, we use a royal fork to pick the queen back up here. And after we pick up the queen, our knight is very fortuitously able to defend the bishop here on h4. Now, this game is not over yet, but after a trade down on h4 and black captures back here, white is significantly better in this position. The knight is stronger than the bishop, black's pawn structure is terrible, and also white's rooks are jumping into the game with a very, very large in-game advantage for Tal. Very close to winning, although maybe not quite there in terms of being able to call this just technically over. So, after bishop f5, the third choice is the one that Hecht goes for. He captures here on h4. allowing his queen to fall on e6. We talked earlier about the weakness of d6 after we push the pawn. That is the justification for this, so that if the bishop is captured back, we simply give knight d6 check and we win the bishop on b7. Hecht now plays bishop a6, mixing it up a little bit, and it looks like Tal might have overextended, and his brilliance might actually falter. However, he does have a response here to the fact that both of these pieces are hanging. It is knight d6 check, and then after the king moves, bishop back to c4. This is a lifeline tactic, one of my favorite lesser known tactics here. You use this when you've got multiple pieces hanging, or at least one piece hanging, and you use an undefended piece from the opponent to create a lifeline. You counterattack that undefended piece, and if the undefended piece captures you, then your other hanging piece can jump back to safety. And again, Tal is better in this position here, although it's not quite over. The problem for black is that white's much more active, and the pawn structure reeks for black. The pawns are falling very, very quickly. After bishop c4, using the lifeline tactic to stay up a piece, his opponent played rook takes g7. He played g3 because there was the attack on g2. And now we get king takes d6, bishop takes on a6. Again, we are down to the endgame. This is actually the game continuation, not a variation. And now Tal is better, but the game is not over. We're going to zip through the endgame relatively quickly, though, because the famous queen sacrifice positions that have occurred are really the focus of this video. Tal's going to activate his rooks, and he's going to start hounding his opponent's pawns. Here, king f2 wasn't even really necessary, but it's nice to activate the king like this. Pawn to c4, and he plays g4, which is a little bit odd because later black might be able to get counterplay with h5 or f5, and the pawn's not really better on g4 than it was on g3, and the knight's not good on f5, so why do we want to push it to e7 as in the game when it can head to d5? Simpler was rook to b4 here, going after these weak pawns and keeping a nice structure here over on the king side. In any case, though, Tal does play pawn to g4. The knight falls back to e7. We get rook b7 activating here. He might have really liked the pin here, which is why he might have gone for g4. But after rook to g8, black is starting to get a little bit of counterplay here, and the pin doesn't amount to a great deal. Bishop takes c4, hitting that rook on g8, but the knight hops into d5. Bishop takes, pawn takes here, and rook to b4. This was the critical moment of this endgame. Black has to seek counterplay here, and pawn h5 is a good way to do it. Suddenly the rooks make sense on the g file here. Some pawn exchanges are coming, and black's rooks are getting very active. This is still better for Tal, but can he win this position? That's not entirely clear at all against good defense. However, that wasn't played in the game. His opponent decided to try to activate a different way with rook to c8, but that leaves this pawn structure healthy, and the other rook over here remains passive. So now we're in conversion territory. Rook takes a4, rook takes c3, rook check, going after f6. f6 is gobbled up, so this pawn is hit. Black does try pawn h5 now, but a little bit too late. Pawn h3 here, and we're going to have two connected passed pawns for white. We get a trade here, rook to h7, pawn to g5 here. Rook to h5, attacking that pawn on g5. Rook here, attacking this and defending. Always nice when we can do both. Check, king up, and now rook here is a nice move that immediately threatens this pawn right here, but it's also defending along the fifth rank so that after pawn d4, we can push forward here with g6. We've got a runner, and this runner should be enough to win the game. The key here is going to be that these rooks are well positioned to eventually go behind the passed pawn and force its promotion. We get a trade of one rook here, and then it's time for king f4. Rook g5 is coming, and after rook g1, rook g5. Hecht did resign in this position. There's no way to prevent the coming promotion of the g-pawn, which will win the game. After rook takes g5, king takes g5, it is worth pointing out that both players do get to make queens here, but after black queens, we got to look one move further. Queen to b3 check, and we trade queens, and then we promote the f-pawn, and black does not get to promote a second queen to compete with our new queen. I hope you liked the game. If you did, you can check out more of the games from Mikhail Tal that I've been looking through on this channel. Simply go and click right over here on the chessboard.